Okay, so in the first part, I connected together magic in general, some ancient texts, and suggested the possibility that dance, Egyptian dance, might be an important aspect or key to this. And I left off with a mention of a line from the Ritual Jew, the Painter of Hieroglyphs. This is an ancient Egyptian magical text, small one, very dense, but small text, which has a line in which, when you become possessed in this ritual, in which the operator says, "Sight is in my feet." Okay. So one important aspect of dance, of the PGM, why I mentioned the PGM, is the PGM is, if you look at them, I'll show you a few examples on the screen. Some bits make complete sense as spells or invocations that just are as they are. They speak it as it is. But then interspersed with all sorts of strange bits, which people variously call barbarous names of power, meaning kind of mysterious, or strange sequences of letters and signs, some of which may be kind of garbled versions of Egyptian magical utterances, and some of them clearly are that, or seem right. It's almost like the bit of Egyptian magic that we commonly use, which is the use of the the vowels A, E, I, O, U. If I say A, E, I, O, U, as we did at school, A, E, I, O, U, the vowels, I unintentionally, I might also be speaking an Egyptian magical phrase, which means "Oh hail," or welcome, if you like. It's a possibility. So some of the bits in the magical papyri are like that. The spells. Sometimes it's obvious. You can translate them directly. It's quite clear what they're. And sometimes you need a little bit of detective work to kind of put it back together. And sometimes it's just the first word of a spell, which then is all you need to know. Right? You just know the first word of the spell, and it's kind of rest is understood. It's almost like etc. Some of which are like acronyms or special codes that magicians, it's like they learn it at school. They're supposed to be like abracadabra or Abla Nathan Alba or something, so kind of word puzzles. And some of them, quite a lot of these, I would suggest to you are transcriptions of melodies and of rhythms for dance. That's maybe a new idea, but I think it works really. It's a kind of coded thing, and as I go on, I'll explain how. You see, in magic, where you're dealing with spirits, there's an idea that each spirit has a particular signature, might be a name, but a signature of some sort, and this is the same from positions of old time, like a mantra, if you like, from the Hindu tradition. And particular spirits are invoked by certain sounds or sound patterns, certain songs, if you like. So spirits have their own song, and in order to invoke that spirit, you have to know their song. And some of these things, I mean, we're talking about how to reclaim music that hasn't survived. We don't really have any other transcription system, or not a very clear transcription system for music and dance from the ancient world. It took us a while to get that in the West anyway. They may well have had a transcription system, but in that burning of books that I mentioned, probably books on music also suffered the same fate as books on magic. unfortunately. But wherever way you look at it, there's obviously an underlying kind of compendium, if you like, dictionary or lexicon of signatures, that musical signatures that invoke certain spirits, and that, as I'll show later, is an idea that survived, and then we can use to kind of read this back into the modern world. In fact, it's quite a reasonable idea. So certain patterns, certain ways of using the body, certain sounds, and certain ways of movement and signing invoke certain spirits. And my suggestion is that in the PGM, some of these collections of phonemes and signs and whatever are connected to that as well. There are actually a whole class of hymns and invocations known from dynastic Egypt itself, which are called danced hymns. They're hymns that have to be danced in order to bring them to life. There's a whole cluster of these, if you like. So the tradition is there, right? It's not something that that is unknown of. So you'd expect at the end of its development that Egypt would kind of continue to do that. It would have a strong relationship between certain movements, certain sounds, and certain magical acts. So this is what we're getting at, what we're trying to reconstruct. So if you like, my kind of little insight or contribution to understanding and bringing to life these ancient spells would be, let me take those off, would be that, right? It's trying to reconstruct some of the patterns that go with these from the PGM and turn them back into dances, if you like, or connect them back to dances. I mean, obviously I'm going to have to use a lot of imagination, a lot of insight, and I'm going to have a lot of help from the spirit world and other people to do this. But I don't know, I kind of feel I want to do this. Or I feel drawn to this. So if I stick my neck out a little bit, right, which I want to do, I would say that there are probably 72 basic dance patterns or signatures, and that these correspond to 72 types of spirit, and maybe even 72 types of illness or disease, because there's a religious aspect to this, often a therapeutic component to all of this stuff. This stuff is also therapy in lots of ways, which is something that we'll explore eventually. Now obviously 72, I mean, if you're familiar with any of these Western esoteric traditions things, then you might, that number's going to ring a bell. Okay. Which is why I'm using it, really, is because the number 72, which is a number related to astronomy, essentially, and astrology, recurs so often in the material, in all sorts of different texts. It just pops up all the time, that it's got to be there almost, you know. And you know, it is known that, say, in the later times, there are, you know, even in places, even in the Persian world, in modern times, there's a classification within Islamic therapeutic dance, really, of 72 different types of conditions that they might encounter with. It's the disease, whether it's depression or whatever, becomes your demonic initiator in a way, because these things are also related to demons. You may seek therapy and help from the magician because initially you're possessed, or because there's something wrong with you. You have a disease. You're depressed, or epilepsy, or whatever it might be. Some other affliction. It's often that propels you to seek help. And the process of dealing with that, the exorcism, as people talk about the text of Ritual of Jew as an exorcism text, but it's slightly misleading. You have to know something about what the nature of exorcism was in this context. It was a little bit different to some of the ideas that people might have. Because exorcism is a kind of initiation as well. The process of exorcism initiates you into a particular sect of the people, and you become a representative of that particular spirit within the circle. That is your initiation, really. So, and thus we might call that a demonic initiation. So I'm going to say that, not that I've discovered 72 of these things, but this is my working hypothesis, if you like, right? That given that that this is such a common way of looking at things and classifying things in our tradition, I'm guessing there must be 72 of these things. Yeah, I mean, I was going to mention that there's one text you might look up, right, is the Goetia, right, which is a kind of very, very popular text now, right, amongst neo-pagans. And of course, in the Goetia has these 72 spirits. And rather helpfully, it says in the Goetia that they speak the Egyptian tongue, so I kind of think it probably comes from Egypt as well. But the subject of the 72 spirits, I'm not going to go into that in too much detail now. That relates to the decans and the demonic calendar of Egypt, and maybe that would be a good subject for another talk. I'll do that another time. Okay, so I've been working on this material for a while now, and my focus, I would thought, is Egypt, but slightly outside of the formal temple culture. And as an idea, there's not one culture, not even one language spoken in dynastic Egypt. There's certainly not one unified view. Lots of different views seem to have been competing with each other, which is normal. That's life, isn't it? That's the way you would expect it to be, rather than the idea of one fixed system. And my emphasis tends to be on what broadly you might call the folk religion in dynastic Egypt, which people say they didn't even know that it existed, but it kind of does, right? There's the evidence from what's happening outside of the big temples, the wonderful temples, really, has to be said. I mean, sometimes it gets taken inside as well. There's some sort of interflow between the two domains, the domain of formal religion in the temple and the domain of the home and the village and the place outside of the temple wall. There's archaeological remains, so you have to use archaeology sometimes rather than just text, of the ordinary people interacting physically with the outside walls, sort of scraping bits off, but also doing things there. And some of the things they did outside get brought inside, but my emphasis is mainly, and my specialism is mainly on the folk magic, is what interests me. So the folk tradition, the people, if you like, is this interesting area that I've kind of stumbled into, if you like, looking at dynastic records of Egyptian dance and music, and also trying to do these things, not just having reconstructed a dance so I try and actually make the music and do it. Now maybe I'll show some examples of either me, probably other people, from known films of people sort of doing some of this stuff as I see it. Obviously the records are going to be a little bit limited because there's no record, there's no way in the dynastic world of recording this material. They didn't have tape recorders and stuff, which is why we kind of we ignore it, because we tend to interact with this stuff via books, which are silent really, or they're working in our head, but we kind of ignore all the kind of other stuff which may have even been more important. I mean, that's the case, I suppose, with someone like Crowley, even Crowley, or whatever it was 50 years ago, people reconstruct that in a very wordy way, very intellectual way. Then they tend to ignore all the kind of dance and music and multimedia that even he tried to put into his stuff. Influenced as he was by kind of early electronic music almost, or certainly early lighting techniques. But of course that doesn't really come across in a book very much. We just think it's probably not important, but it's probably the most important bit. As I say, the further we go back, not only do we have the problem about transcription, we have the problem that a lot of the stuff is actively suppressed. So, hence people call this, there's a name, a posh name for this stuff now, which is called speculative music. Great. And I think there's a very interesting website, I'll put the link on the screen, of speculative music, which has some very interesting articles on some of the attempts people are making to kind of bring this material back into our world. And in another talk, I'm going to talk about also surviving performance, Magick, in the modern world within the Arabic folk tradition, really, Islamic folk tradition, and show some material from the portal there, really, samples of people bringing, recording the material before it dies out, really, and bringing it back to life and fusing it with new instrumentation. So that's always quite good, but that's for a future stuff. So just briefly then to finish, one particular, every temple obviously had a company, a cohort, if you like, a company of dancers who worked in the temple and were quite busy and had a lot of stuff, and they're often depicted on the temple inscriptions and in tombs and all the rest. Lots of different ones, but rather confusingly as well, sometimes they had their own bit in the temple, really, where they kept their records and maybe they rehearsed and stuff like that before they went out. But sometimes it's translated as harem, which gives you the wrong idea. I think maybe there was some interaction between the dance cohort and the palace harem in a way, or the women of the palace. Maybe they did some of this music, maybe they interacted. So it gives you so it's another example of where a tradition has been kind of hidden by the language, by a mistake in the language. Anyway, there were a particular cohort of dancers that I'm very, very interested in, called the Moo dancers. I'm saying Moo, maybe it should be Moo, but that's a bit of a mouthful, so I'm going to call them the Moo dancers, like the justified ancients of Moo. They were ritual specialists. I'm putting their name up on the screen there. Some of them were obviously what you would call virtuoso dancers by the depictions. And obviously you have to know something about how to decode Egyptian art in order to make sense of this stuff. So, for instance, an entertainment dance such as is shown in the picture, you kind of think, well, I don't know about that, but probably done at a party or something like that. But if you look at an equivalent step in jazz dance, which hopefully I can show you in the picture, you see how that's quite a very pleasing dance step. Especially if a bunch of people do that from jazz dance, but also it takes a certain amount of skill and physicality to do that, which would be good for you, of course. So there are obviously virtuoso dancers who do that sort of stuff and danced at parties, and then there's another type of dancer who danced at other events, perhaps festivals, but the mood dancers, their main function was to dance at funerals. And they're often shown as part of a procession at a funeral. They're not the mourners, they're doing a dance. And that's maybe for us in the West something a little bit strange about that already. The idea of people having a dance performed at a funeral is not something we're used to. It's not something we would normally do, but the more you think about it, the more it seems, yeah, that's kind of good idea, really. or it's got a power to it. The cohort of dancers, the company of dancers, were obviously mixed. There are men and women shown, although the dancers, although they're there as a group, the men seem to dance as a do a group dance together, and women do a group dance together. There's not a mixed group dance that I've seen samples of, although maybe one might arise. So they're doing some sort of synchronized dance to the dead, and that very strange thing about lots of strange things about, but one of the things that very, very much caught my imagination and is interesting is, along with the group of dancers doing this Mu dance in one way or another, which we can say lots of things about that, they're followed up by something you might miss, which is a solitary female practitioner doing something odd. And often she's shown in very rare images of her with not wearing. I don't think she's wearing a wig. I think it must be her own hair, which is another interesting thing again. She has very, very long, unkempt, dishevelled hair, which is very suggestive of certain magical states, and occurs in other dance traditions as well, letting your hair down, essentially. When a woman with a very long hair, or like the headbangers, really kind of let the hair down, let it go wild and not combed, and they kind of obviously shake it around. Like the goddess Kali, like Mary Magdalene, one of her penance, when she was naked apart from her long unkempt hair. There's lots and lots of resonances of this. So there's this practitioner that we don't really know a lot about her. But we certainly like to know more about her, because this is kind of getting to the heart of the matter. And she follows up behind in this kind of, I suppose you'd say, this shamanic dance type thing, rocking and shaking her hair down to the ground, and she reaches down into the soil, and according to the inscription, she kind of does something. She pulls the spirits or ghosts out of the earth, or she greets them in some way. And this is all taking place, this performance, this magical performance, in the context of the funeral itself. So you can see there are very interesting elements to the Egyptian stuff that we are looking at, and that it's going to take a long time to reenact them and to kind of get them out eventually. So again, together with this movement, there's a particular type of music being constructed, a rhythm pattern, and that rhythm pattern itself and the way that they're making the music has a very, very interesting history in its own right. Some of these instruments, like the sistrum and whatever, they morph into other instruments and are used in similar contexts, and that's very, very, suggestive tradition. So we learn from them. So we can still find people playing the same type of music in a way, or we can theorize that they are. So we can use that as a clue to how it might have done. How everybody knows it had the sistrum as an instrument, but how is it actually played, and how did you interact with it, and how did you dance with it, how did you sing, how did you recite with that kind of music? So some of this we kind of have to experiment with, kind of get to see what works, what gets us into that altered state, where we are kind of able to ferry the dead over to the other side. This might be one way of putting it. So this is part of the Egyptian background and introduction to the Egyptian background to dance, and some of the sources that we are using, both to reconstruct the dance and also to feed it back to work out the mindset of those ancestors of ours, which is what we really want to get at. We want to kind of, because they were so good at magic, we want to sort of learn from them. As they say, if you do the action like the master, you become the master. You bridge the vast period of time, and that's maybe what we're doing. Okay, so I'm going to leave it there for now. Let it soak in. I think this is a tradition that is really crying out to be rediscovered and worked with one way or another. So I thought I'd talk about that. And next time then I'm going to return to this issue next month with a discussion of some of the later sources of dance, especially ritual dance and exorcism dance in the Middle East, especially within Egypt, that somehow seems to capture some of the flavour of the Egyptian original, and so it seems legitimate to use one to reconstruct the other, and all sorts of reasons why that really works. But this is going to take us again into the folk religion, which seems, wherever empires come and go, the folk seem to keep these traditions going. We don't always know that. We kind of ignore it, but it's there. Anyway, thanks for listening, and if any feedback, leave it on the comment section, and I'll try and cover that next time.